All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight, presented by FanDuel here at The Volume. Happy Wednesday, everybody. I hope all of you guys are having a great week so far. We are moving on with our power rankings today. On to number 14, the Minnesota Timberwolves. A really, really interesting team to dive into because, once again, we have to throw away just about everything from last season because they traded out a bunch of their players for Rudy Gobert, which obviously changes fundamentally the identity of this particular basketball team. They should be a really, really interesting watch this year. They have one of my favorite young players in the league in Anthony Edwards. It was a lot of fun diving into this. You guys know the drill. Before we get started, subscribe to the Volume's YouTube channel so you don't miss any more of our videos. Follow me on Twitter at _JasonLT so you guys don't miss any show announcements. And last but not least, if you miss one of these videos and you can't get back over to YouTube to finish them, you can find them in audio form wherever you get your podcasts under Hoops Tonight. One last thing, please bear with me, guys. Last week on Thursday, when I said I had allergies, turns out I had some sort of upper respiratory illness, was not COVID. I tested negative. It really took it out of me. It's the most sick I've been since I had COVID, which was in the fall of 2020. And I'm kind of over it now, but it has destroyed my lungs and destroyed my voice, and I've been dealing with some coughing and stuff. So apologies in advance for just the lack of overall vocal energy, but I appreciate you guys bearing with me. All right, so last year, the Timberwolves were 7th in offense, 13th in defense. They were one of the teams, for those of you guys who are following the show at this point, as the season was coming to an end, the regular season, this is one of the teams that I was focusing on a lot because they were playing really, really well. Now, there is some context there. Like, they went 30-16 over their last 46 games. That was from January 3rd to the end of the season. But they did play a lot of teams that were, good in the sense that it showed their strength of schedule to be strong because of the records of the teams they were playing. But like almost every night that they were playing a good team, somebody was sitting out. And this is classic NBA load management problems. You guys know I would love to see them cut the season down from 82 to 66 games. I know that's a non-starter for the owners and the players because they want money. But to me, it's pretty simple. I believe that right now the product is crap because almost every time you get a marquee matchup on national TV, at least one star is missing, if not both, because of the need that teams feel to prepare for load management throughout the season. If you shortened the schedule to the point where teams were only playing 3 times a week, they'd have automatic baked-in load management. They'd have at least one stretch every week where they'd have 2 consecutive nights off. I think it would lead to a league where almost every one of these marquee matchups had all the stars playing. And not to mention an additional 20% of urgency in how much value there is in a win or how much pain there is in a loss. I believe that 20% decrease in regular season volume of games would be replaced by at least a 20% increase in quality of play. But that's another separate soapbox for me there. But the Timberwolves were a huge beneficiary of that last year. They ended up going, like I said, from January 3rd on 30-16. They had the number 1 offense in the league during that span, the number 16 defense, number 5 overall in net rating. They end up getting out of the play-in tournament and they make it to the Grizzlies in a really bizarre series where they lose in 6 games, but they end up pretty much controlling 5 of the 6 games. They just completely fell apart at the end of every single game. For those of you guys who remember when I did that series preview for that particular series, my biggest fear for Minnesota going into that series was late game decision making. And you're going to hear me talk about this a lot. Basketball games are won and lost at the end in a lot of cases because it's a lot easier in a smaller sample size for the better team to lock in and really truly, become what their basketball identity is. And if they're the better team than you, they're going to take care of business down the stretch of a game. Yes, for 3 quarters, you might be able to hang with them for one reason or another because maybe they don't truly feel threatened or whatever the deal is. But at the end of a game, you become who you truly are as a basketball team. And I was worried that Anthony Edwards, who I really like but is young, and D'Angelo Russell, who's a player that I don't particularly like, I had a feeling that they were going to struggle with late game decision making, and they did. In the 4th quarters of that series, the Timberwolves were outscored by 41.6 points per 100 possessions. They were absolutely terrible on both ends of the floor. In clutch time, so when the games were within 5 points with less than 5 minutes remaining, they had a negative 40.6 net rating. So they were outscored by 40.7 points every 100 possessions, terrible on both ends of the floor. So they were a terrible 4th quarter team and a terrible clutch team, which was my biggest fear going into that series. And it cost them because you could argue that they were the better team. And they controlled throughout that series. They frequently had large leads, and they just weren't able to do anything with it. Excuse me. So obviously in this offseason, the Timberwolves undergo a change of in their basketball operations department. They bring in Tim Connolly. He immediately is very aggressive and makes the Rudy Gobert trade, flipping Patrick Beverley, their starting point guard, Malik Beasley, their starting 2 guard, their or 3, depending on whether or not they were starting D'Lo on any given moment. And then Jared Vanderbilt, their best wing on the roster. They flipped those 3 guys, a couple of younger players, 4 first-round draft picks, and a pick swap for Rudy Gobert. I was truly shocked by that. I thought Rudy Gobert was a negative asset. Now, to be clear, there's a difference between negative asset and negative player. I just thought because of Rudy's offensive limitations and the fact that he was going to be making 40 plus million, longer, all the way to like 2026 or something, that teams would be hesitant to trade for him. Clearly, I was wrong about that. There was at least one GM in the league who viewed him as very valuable. But so essentially what they did, if you zoomed out from that trade, they exchanged 3 really good perimeter defenders for 1 great backline anchor, arguably the best in the league. I think Anthony Davis, when he's engaged, is a little better. I think Giannis is a little better, but I think Gobert's right there as a top 3 defensive player in all of basketball. He's one of those guys that's kind of become the butt of the joke for a lot of basketball fans, but that's not actually backed up with what you see in tape. The defensive issues for the Utah Jazz had nothing to do with Rudy Gobert and everything to do with everybody else on their roster. I expect him to come in and immediately make Minnesota a great defensive team. They also signed Kyle Anderson, Austin Rivers, and Bryn Forbes. Kyle Anderson and Austin Rivers are both above average defensive players for their position. Both of them are somewhat inconsistent offensively. We'll get in a little bit further into them later. Kyle Anderson can do some stuff attacking smaller defenders and shooting over the top. Austin Rivers is capable as an on-ball creator, but obviously below average compared to some of his peers around the league. And then Bryn Forbes is your textbook off the bench type of shooter. NBA coaches are constantly obsessed with like what they can do to run offense for periods of the game when their stars are out of the game. And they have the ability to run offensive players off of screens. That's in their offense already. They did that a lot with Malik Beasley last year. I think they'll run some similar sets like that with Bryn Forbes this year off the bench. They also drafted Wendell Moore Jr. He's a classic wing that can do a little bit of everything, but I don't think he'll play much this year. If we look at the depth chart at the guard position, they're guard heavy. They have D'Angelo Russell, Anthony Edwards, Jalen Noel, Bryn Forbes, Austin Rivers, and Jordan McLaughlin. Jalen Noel and Jordan McLaughlin are going to be 2 interesting guys to watch. I don't know a ton about them at this point. I need to watch more film, but those are 2 guys from what I've heard that Minnesota's depending on big time to replace a little bit of what Malik Beasley and Patrick Beverley did for them. On the wing, Kyle Anderson, Taurean Prince, and Jaden McDaniels. And then as bigs, they have Rudy Gobert, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Naz Reid. So on the offensive end of the floor, they run a lot of isolation. They were the 7th most frequent isolation team last year and the 4th most efficient. Now, generally speaking, isolation is kind of viewed as like a bad word in the basketball world, especially amongst coaches, because they associate it with stagnation. And a lot of coaches don't like ISO because they think of it as like bad offense, essentially. To me, though, I think isolation is a little bit undervalued, especially in the modern NBA, for a couple of different reasons. First of all, in a playoff setting in particular, a lot of teams do a lot more switching than usual. And in addition to that, they scout your sets. And so your sets are far less likely to actually generate quality shots in a playoff setting than they are in the regular season, because every coach has seen, like the advanced scouts have seen every single play you've run during the season. They've charted how often you ran those plays, and they've presented that information to the coaching staff, and the coaching staff coaches the players on how to jump in front of specific actions to deny maybe an entry pass here or there to stop the play from taking place, or a pre-planned switch to take care of a shooter coming off of a screen, or whatever the action is. They find ways to scout ahead of that stuff. And so a lot of times in playoff series, it does devolve into isolation basketball. And, what it really comes down to with isolation basketball is physical advantages. And, Anthony Edwards and Karl Towns have physical advantages over almost every single defensive player that they're going to face in this league, right? So it's not bad for them to rely on a good amount of isolation basketball. I think it's smart for what their roster can do. And again, a lot of ISO. They were the number one offense in the league for more than the second half of the season, a little bit over, like 46 games or something like that. So that's pretty substantial. The other thing with isolation basketball, the second big advantage, is it's avoiding bringing other defenders into the play. So, if I run a pick and roll or some sort of off-ball screening action or dribble handoff or anything that involves multiple offensive players in some sort of exchange, what's going to happen there is I'm bringing other defenders to the play. So if I'm bringing the ball up the floor on the right wing and I call for a pick and roll, and the other team is scared of me and they want to try to get the ball out of my hands or use second defenders or third defenders to dissuade me from getting to my spots, if I bring a screener up, it's easier. I'm bringing a second defender up. And if their plan is to get the ball out of my hand, they can jump me on that pick and roll by trapping, right? Or like if I'm running a dribble handoff or an off-ball screening action, by bringing that second defender into the play, I make it easier for the other team potentially to deny me the basketball. Even though, yes, it will lead to openings elsewhere, it does cause some problems for you as the ball handler. In isolation, if they're going to offer help, they're going to have to straight up abandon their man to do so, which allows you to open up things in terms of drive and kick. So there are advantages to ISO. Don't let coaches and old-fashioned basketball minds convince you that it's a bad thing. It needs to be done smartly. It needs to be done with the right matchups. It needs to be done when you have physical advantages, and it needs to be done with the proper spacing, and it needs to be done with while taking into account rhythm and the way that the other players on the floor are impacted. To make a long story short, isolation's fine, but just like any other thing, it's about balance and figuring out how you can have counters from that or mix things up so that you don't become predictable. I am not an anti-ISO basketball guy. In terms of pick and roll, they did not run a lot of pick and roll last year. They were 24th in pick and roll attempts. That's to be expected. They didn't have a good roll man. Naz Reid is a good big man, and obviously Karl-Anthony Towns is dynamic as a scorer and as a perimeter shooter, but he's not a good roll man. He's not a vertical spacer. So it wasn't a thing that they were going to do last year because it didn't play into their strengths. But that is one of the very few things that Rudy Gobert is good at. My criticisms of Rudy Gobert mainly lie on the offensive end of the floor. I think his inability to punish switches and post-up situations is a problem. I think he's generally slow making decisions, so he's not good in the short roll. Obviously, he can't shoot from the perimeter. But there are two things on offense that he's outstanding at. He's an outstanding screener, and he's an outstanding vertical threat. So what's one thing I can do on the offensive end of the floor that's going to properly use Rudy Gobert and what he does well? Pick and roll. So even though they were 24th in pick and roll attempts last year, I expect a significant increase in the Timberwolves pick and roll offense this year. I expect them to do it a whole lot more. One last note on Rudy. He is very good as an offensive rebounder as well. That's one of the things that he can do on the offensive end. But he is somewhat limited on that. He's straight up just a role player, even maybe less than that on the offensive end of the floor. They ran a lot of off-screen plays last year. They were 7th most in the NBA. But again, that was a lot of Malik Beasley. The vast majority of their off-screen actions were Malik Beasley flying off of screens and pin downs to look to shoot or to curl around and try to make a play. With him being gone, I expect that to kind of go by the wayside. So just kind of think like they were a lot of ISO last year. There will be a lot of ISO. They were not very much pick and roll last year. I expect a lot more pick and roll. There were a lot of off-screen stuff last year. I expect a lot less of that. But I do think they'll do a lot of that with Bryn Forbes off the bench, just not enough to make up for what Malik Beasley was doing. So I expect them to be somewhat low volume in that regard. So kind of zooming out, this is a mismatch attacking isolation team that has 2 players that can constantly have physical advantages around the floor, Karl-Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards. And then I think they'll supplement that with a lot of high pick and roll with Rudy Gobert, either with D'Lo and D'Angelo Russell or Ant. Those are the 2 guys that I expect to run a ton of pick and roll with Gobert. When it comes to their isolation play with Karl Towns and with Ant, it's going to all be about spacing. The issue is Rudy Gobert. Because he can't shoot from the perimeter, because he's, basically just a vertical spacing threat who can screen well, he's going to be in the dunker spot a lot, which is going to flat out affect their spacing. The driving lanes are not going to be as good for Anthony Edwards as they were last year. That's simply a fact of that trade. As soon as you made that decision to flip a 5-out team with Karl Towns as your floor spacing big to now having a non-spacing center, it's going to change the dynamic of driving lanes for this team. The other guy that I'm worried about them in terms of their spacing is Kyle Anderson. He's a good defensive wing, and they lost a good defensive wing with Jared Vanderbilt, so I expect them to play him quite a bit. He was 32% on catch-and-shoot threes last year. If they have Kyle Anderson and Rudy Gobert on the floor at the same time, things could really get clogged for them in the paint. One of the benefits about this partnership of having 2 bigs on the offensive end of the floor, we're going to talk about the defensive end. I think the having 2 bigs thing could present some problems for them there. But on the offensive end of the floor, Karl Towns' shooting ability makes it so that, in theory, if you have the other guys that can shoot, it could work out and still have some, usability. Uniquely, what Karl Towns does so well is he's amazing shooting above the break. The vast majority of role players around the league shoot pretty well from the corners and not as well above the break. Simple math, it's a further shot, right? But Karl Towns attempted 5 above the break threes per game last year and shot 42% on them. So you can tuck him further away from the basket. And, especially with him and how quick his release is, he's going to pull a pretty big defensive player really far away from the basket. That will that part will make some of the Gobert lineups at least usable. But I think in the aggregate, the overall spacing of that lineup will not be as good as it was last year. I think Rudy Gobert is going to be in pick and roll as the natural counter to their spacing problem. So again, it's just going to keep him more involved in the offense. If he stands in the dunker spot, any really good defensive big is going to be capable of helping on drives while still dissuading Rudy around the rim. That's going to be a problem for them. But in pick and roll, he's going to have a head of steam going downhill. It's just going to be harder for his defender to deal with him in a pick and roll situation than he is in the dunker spot. So again, pick and roll is going to be their counter to their spacing issues. The number one issue I have with them on the offensive end of the floor is going to be their clutch offense and decision making, like we talked about earlier. So in clutch time, in 18 minutes, against Memphis. So again, that's 18 minutes in the series where there was less than 5 minutes remaining on the clock and the scoring margin was 5 points or less. D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards combined to go 3 for 16 from the field, including 1 for 8 from 3. I don't see that problem going away. Anthony Edwards, again, I really like him, but he's probably several years away from being a good clutch basketball player. Again, at the end of basketball games, like we talked about, teams really flash their true identity. So when you get into late playoff settings and you're going against a really good defensive team and there's a great deal of scouting involved, they're going to find ways to pack the paint on Anthony Edwards and really test his decision-making as a passer and his willingness to settle for pull-up jump shots. Now, for those of you who remember when we did our player rankings video, I had Anthony Edwards pretty high. I think I had him 21, and his pull-up shooting was one of the big revelations of that playoff run. He shot the ball extremely well off the dribble, but he does have a tendency to settle even when he has physical advantages. So again, teams packing the paint, it's going to test Anthony Edwards in his willingness to pass to open shooters and his willingness to avoid difficult pull-up jump shots. So that's going to be my biggest concern for them. Again, if you're going to win the title, if you're going to just come out of the Western Conference, you're probably going to have to out-execute a Steph Curry in a playoff series. You're going to have to out-execute a Nikola Jokic in a playoff series. You're going to have to out-execute a Kawhi Leonard in a playoff series. Hell, if the Lakers figure it out, you might have to out-execute a LeBron James in a playoff series. You might have to do that anyway in a first-round series. So at the end of the day, like, decision-making is going to be the biggest question mark for this particular team on the offensive end. So kind of zooming out, I think Rudy Gobert is legitimately going to mess with their offense. I think they'll take a step back on the offensive end of the floor, and I do think they'll continue to struggle at the end of games. So I expect them to finish somewhere. They were 7th in offensive rating this year. I expect them to finish somewhere closer to 10 this year. Let's move on to the defensive end of the floor. Last year, like we said, they were an average defense. They finished 13th. Even when they got hot towards the end of the year, it wasn't their defense. It was their offense that got going. But again, we have to give Chris Finch a lot of credit here, because when you really look at what they were working with, with Karl Towns, who for his position is one of the worst defensive players to play big minutes in the league, right? And then D'Angelo Russell, who throughout his career has been a bad defensive player. He got both of them to have the best defensive seasons of their career. D'Angelo Russell became a serviceable defensive player. Obviously not a great defensive player, but a serviceable defensive player. And in general, on the roster from the top down, there was a ton of buy-in, especially from their perimeter defenders and their willingness to slide their feet and keep people in front. Again, we've talked a lot about this concept on the show, but it's quickly becoming one of the most important aspects of NBA basketball, your ability to contain ball handlers. Because think of it like this. We think a lot about help schemes, and we think a lot about backline defenders and like things like defensive rotations, but those things aren't necessary if a defender can contain the dribble. If you can contain the dribble and prevent ball handlers from getting into the paint, then you don't have to offer as much help. You don't have to be in rotation as often, and your foot speed on the back line matters less, right? And that was a clear identity from this particular team. They were a team that sat down in a stance and got stops. Malik Beasley did an outstanding job in perimeter contain. Patrick Beverley, one of the best in the league at it. D'Angelo Russell had the best defensive season of his career. Anthony Edwards, best defensive season of his career. I just wanted to give a shout out to Chris Finch there, because I think he did a really good job with this particular group. Again, this team is going to be completely different defensively than they were last year. Last year, they were an average defense because they had great perimeter defensive players, but their back line was weak. This year, I think they've taken a significant step back in perimeter contain, but they brought on arguably the best backline defensive player of this era, depending on who you ask. So at least a top 3, right? Or top 4 if you count Draymond. So from that standpoint, they're going to be a very different defense than they were in the past. My guess is they will prioritize taking away the three-point line with their perimeter players, knowing that they have a lot more help on the back line with Gobert, and probably adapt some sort of funneling scheme where the intent is to try to just get people to drive into Gobert, get terrified because they don't want to get their shot blocked, and then kick it out to defenders that are waiting. That's typically the way that teams will structure their defense when they have outstanding rim protectors, and I expect the Timberwolves to do the same. Obviously, losing Jared Vanderbilt on the wing is big. I actually really like Jaden McDaniels. The hot take, but I actually think he could be a little bit better in the long run. So I didn't hate that exchange. Austin Rivers and Kyle Anderson, like we mentioned earlier, are both above average defensive players for their position. They're just not as good offensively as the players that they lost. And then, the big thing is going to be looking at the difference between what this defense is going to look like in the regular season versus the postseason. Like, I'll just skip ahead right now. I think the Timberwolves are going to have a top 5 defense this year. That's kind of a staple of the Rudy Gobert process, and he's got better defensive players around him than he ever had in Utah. So flat out, I expect the Timberwolves to be a top 5 defense this year, provided that everyone stays healthy. The conundrum there is going to be the difference between what their defensive ceiling is in the regular season versus what it is in the playoffs. Again, in the regular season, drop coverages work pretty damn well, especially in the day in, day out grind of the regular season. It's generally speaking, the scouting isn't as in depth as it is in the postseason. There's a little bit more of like, we're just trying to get through this kind of thing, right? And Gobert's the kind of guy that it's difficult to scheme him away from the rim, but you can do so. It's just hard to do in a 1-game sample size. Sometimes it takes 3-4 games to kind of figure out how to keep him away from the rim. That's why his defensive abilities to clean up messes for his teammates goes down in the playoffs compared to the way it is in the regular season. So for instance, having a D'Angelo Russell on the floor, having Karl Towns on the floor, those two guys potentially on the floor at the same time, losing Patrick Beverley, losing Malik Beasley, that might not matter as much in the regular season because of Gobert cleaning up messes. But when you get to the postseason and teams find out how to keep Rudy Gobert closer to the perimeter and make him guard more in space, it's not that Rudy Gobert loses his value as a defender. He's every bit as good defensively in the postseason as he is in the regular season, but his ability to clean up his teammates' messes goes down significantly in a playoff setting. And so from that specific standpoint, I do think there will be somewhat of a drop-off when they get into the postseason. Because once again, you have Karl Towns on the floor, who doesn't guard well in space. You have D'Angelo Russell, who's a decent help defender, but doesn't guard well in space. So in a playoff setting, teams are going to find a way to attack those guys while keeping Gobert away from the rim. The other thing is transition defense, and this is where having two bigs hurts. I don't need to get all into the weeds again, but you guys know how I feel about big men and the limitations they have in terms of foot speed. And Karl Towns and Rudy Gobert are two of the more mobile bigs that we have in this league, theoretically, right? You know, Karl Towns isn't very laterally quick, but he does have a good first step, and he can beat people off the dribble on offense, and he can run the floor pretty well, right? But the reality is with both of them on the floor, they will be slower footed, especially in the open floor and in 5-out situations, than they were last year. You know, last year, they were the 8th best transition defense in all of basketball. I expect them to take a significant step back in transition defense this year because of them playing with two bigs. So when you factor that in and some of the playoff stuff, I expect them to have a top 5 regular season defense that functions and translates to the postseason more like a 10th best defense in the league type of deal. Again, because of the fact that they're going to have two defenders on the floor that teams are going to try to attack all the time. One of the interesting counters here that I'd like to see them try, especially since I have a feeling that they might end up trying to trade D'Angelo Russell in the long run, but it might be worth benching him, especially in big moments and in playoff series, and going all in on length with a second wing, like going with Jaden McDaniels and Kyle Anderson, or Jaden McDaniels and Taurean Prince alongside Cat, Gobert, and Ant, and kind of going in on defense and understanding that, yes, you're lacking shot creation, but you know, D'Angelo Russell's shot creation didn't translate super well to the postseason anyway. That would be what I would do if I was coaching this team. I'd go all in on defense and just count on Ant and Karl Towns to be able to physically bludgeon the opponent to get enough offense. So best case scenario, if Anthony Edwards takes a leap to superstar, and we're going to get a little bit further into that when we get to X Factor, if Rudy Gobert finds a way to not completely screw up their offense and be somewhat productive there, if Karl Towns plays with consistency, if you guys remember when we did our power rankings, that's one of my biggest issues with Karl Towns is like one night he's dialed in and he's focused and he's making all the right decisions and he's punishing teams with physicality. And then the next night he's just hacking people and getting in foul trouble or just like kind of emotionally pulling away from the game and not being as aggressive physically. And it's just, he's just kind of like an up and down type of personality on the basketball court. If Karl Towns plays with consistency, that would be a huge upside for them. If the team somehow manages to maintain their perimeter defense from last year, that counts on some of these younger players like Noel and McLaughlin coming in and playing well. Austin Rivers coming in and playing well. Kyle Anderson coming in and playing well. If they do that and they replicate their perimeter defense from last year, in combination with what Gobert can do, they could have a great defense, a defense that could be problematic in a playoff series. With their physical mismatches, with what Karl Towns does and Anthony Edwards does in terms of the predicament they put you in as the other team and who's going to guard those guys, I think they're capable of beating anybody in the West except for the Clippers and the Warriors. They have the physical matchups to handle those guys. Draymond Green would eat Karl Towns alive in a playoff series. Andrew Wiggins would give Anthony Edwards some problems, with the Clippers, with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, similar type of deal. So from that standpoint, I think with the exception of those two particular teams, they're capable, if they hit their ceiling, of beating any of those teams, of being a top 4 seed, getting home court advantage in the playoffs. I just don't see them beating those two particular teams. Their worst case scenario, if Gobert comes in and just butchers everything on offense, and again, they were number 1 in offense from January 3rd to the end of the season. I expect them to take a little bit of a step back, at least on that end, but it could get ugly with Gobert, especially with how much Karl Towns and Anthony Edwards like to drive the ball to the basket. Them having 2 bigs, if teams find ways to kill them in transition or spacing the floor, a really good team like the Clippers could put them in a 5-out situation where Karl Towns and Gobert are playing more like perimeter players, guarding people in a drive and kick system. That could be a problem. Obviously, we talked about bad late game decision-making from D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards. Injuries could always be an issue. If those things all crop up, this is a play-in team again. And that would be an absolute disaster with how much they paid for Gobert in that trade. The biggest X factor on this team, in my opinion, without question, is Anthony Edwards. So last year, he was something like the 25th best player in the world. I ranked him 21st because of what I value from him in particular, but that's kind of where I see him at this exact moment in time. But he's a young player that has a great deal of potential. Not just a great deal of potential, he has like true superstar potential, like top 10 player in the world potential. Like look a Luka Doncic type of player in the face and play every bit as good as him, if not better, in a playoff series type of potential. That's what he's capable of. That's what I see from him 5 years from now. So then it becomes about timeline. Is it going to be now? Does he take that leap this year? Does he take it in 2 years? Does he take it in 4 years? That becomes the question. He's built for the playoffs because he's big and strong. That's why his scoring and efficiency went up when he got into that stage. Obviously, he flashed a ton as a pull-up jump shooter in that playoff run. It remains to be seen if that's real or if that was just a hot streak. We will find out during the season. He gets to the rim a lot. That translates well to the playoffs. And as an athlete, he has tons of defensive potential. If Anthony Edwards takes a leap to become a top 10 player in basketball, all of a sudden, then they're a contender. Coming into this show, I had them in that tier below as non-contenders. The Bulls, the Pelicans, this particular Wolves team, I didn't see them as a team that was capable of winning a championship, and I still don't. But if Anthony Edwards is not the 21st best player in the league this year, if he's the 8th best player in the league this year, then you're damn right they're a contender. And that absolutely puts them in a situation where they could be a dominant defensive team built around Gobert with a super duper star in Anthony Edwards that could squeeze out a playoff series or win a big matchup against a great superstar in this league. And so he is the biggest X factor of this team because of his upside. His upside is so high that this Timberwolves team is capable, when he reaches whatever that point is, some point in the next couple of years, Ant's going to become that guy. And when he does, this is going to be a damn good basketball team. And it's always a risk that it could be this particular season. Obviously, if he's a couple of years away, they could be a play-in team. They could be a 6 or 7 seed. They could lose in the first round. They could lose in the second round. But that's the big swing factor in this particular season, is how good does Anthony Edwards get. All right, that is all I have for tonight, guys. That's all I have on the Minnesota Timberwolves. We'll be back with number 13 tomorrow. As always, I appreciate your guys' support, and I will see you guys then.